There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got last night. It is not the tiredness that comes from working long hours or pushing through a difficult day. It is something quieter than that, and in many ways, heavier. It is the exhaustion that settles in when you realize that time keeps moving, days turning into weeks, weeks into months, and yet something inside you feels completely, painfully still. You know the feeling. You have probably felt it more than once. That sense that your life is running on a kind of invisible pause. That everyone around you seems to be moving forward, while you are standing in the same place you were standing last year, maybe even the year before that. You look at your goals, the ones you wrote down, the ones you whispered to yourself in quiet moments alone, and you realize they are still just goals, still just ideas, still waiting, and waiting, and waiting. And the hardest part is not that nothing has happened. The hardest part is that you wanted it to. You genuinely wanted to move. You intended to change things. You told yourself that this time would be different, that you would start that project, take that step, make that call, begin that thing you have been putting off for longer than you care to admit. And then, somehow, you did not. Not because you stopped caring, not because the goal stopped mattering to you, but because something you cannot always see or name, kept pulling you back. Perhaps it showed up as a vague sense that the timing was not quite right. Perhaps it looked like a sudden interest in something else, something easier, something that did not require the same vulnerability as the thing you actually wanted to pursue. Perhaps it came dressed as common sense, as being realistic, being responsible, being smart about your choices. These are all very convincing costumes for the thing that is actually happening beneath them. And what is actually happening, in most cases, is this: the mind is doing what minds are designed to do. It is protecting you from discomfort, from uncertainty, from the risk of trying and falling short. The protection feels rational in the moment. It even feels kind, a reasonable, sensible response to the complexity of life. But protection that becomes permanent stops being kindness and starts being a cage. And that is where so many thoughtful, capable, deeply intentional people find themselves, not held back by their circumstances, but held back by the very system of self-protection that was supposed to help them navigate those circumstances wisely. That is what we are going to explore together in this audiobook. Not with judgment, not with the kind of relentless positivity that papers over real difficulty with hollow reassurance, and not with the implication that feeling stuck is your fault in some simple, correctable way. What we are going to do is something more honest and more lasting. We are going to look clearly at what is actually happening inside the mind when it feels stuck. We are going to examine the specific psychological patterns, familiar, deeply human patterns, that create the experience of stagnation even in people who are perfectly capable of movement. Because here is what most people never fully understand about feeling stucky. It is not a character flaw. It is not a sign that you are broken or lazy or fundamentally incapable of growth. Feeling stuck is, in most cases, a deeply human response to real psychological forces at work beneath the surface. Forces like fear, uncertainty, perfectionism, and the brain's natural resistance to change. Forces that operate quietly, consistently, and often invisibly, until you learn to see them for what they are. And that is the beginning of everything. Seeing them. You cannot untangle a knot you refuse to look at. You cannot release a grip that you do not acknowledge is there. So the first and most important thing this audiobook will ask of you is simply this: be willing to look honestly at what is happening inside you, not with self-criticism, not with the sharp edge of self-blame, but with the kind of calm, clear curiosity that makes genuine growth possible. The kind of curiosity that says, I want to understand this. I want to see it clearly. Not because I need to punish myself for it, but because understanding is where change begins. There is a version of you that is not stuck, a version that moves through life with more ease, more courage, more consistency. That version is not some distant fantasy, existing in a parallel life you cannot reach. It is the same you, just with a clearer understanding of what has been holding you back and a willingness to take small, deliberate steps in a new direction. The path forward is not dramatic. It does not require a complete personality overhaul or a sudden surge of motivation. It requires something much simpler and, in its own way, much braver: understanding yourself a little better and then deciding to move anyway. So let us begin, not with pressure, not with urgency, but with the quiet, steady intention of someone who is done waiting and ready, in whatever small way they can manage today, to start moving again. Most of us, when we feel stuck, immediately look outward for an explanation. We point to our circumstances, the job that is unfulfilling, the relationship that is complicated, the finances that are not where we hoped they would be, the city we live in, the people around us, the opportunities that have not appeared. And sometimes, those external factors are genuinely significant. Life is not always fair or simple, and circumstances matter. They shape what is available to us and what is not. External context is real and worth acknowledging. But here is something worth sitting with, something that often goes unexamined. Two people can face nearly identical external circumstances and respond to them in completely different ways. One person sees obstacles and finds a way through. Another person sees those same obstacles and stops moving. The external reality is the same. What differs is something that happens internally, in how the mind processes uncertainty, difficulty, and risk, in what the nervous system does when it encounters the unknown, in what stories a person tells themselves about what the obstacle means and what they are capable of in the face of it. And this is where the real work begins. One of the most common and most underestimated reasons people feel stuck is fear. Not the dramatic, immediately obvious fear of something clearly dangerous, but the quiet, background kind. The kind that does not announce itself as fear at all. It shows up as hesitation, as I'll do it later, as I'm just not ready yet, as a vague, persistent sense that something is off, even when you cannot quite name what it is or why it keeps you in place. Fear of failure is perhaps the most well-known member of this family. If you try and it does not work out, what does that mean? That you are not capable. That you were foolish to believe in the possibility. That others will see you attempt something and fail, and will think less of you for having tried. The mind does not always think these thoughts explicitly. More often, it just generates a low, persistent reluctance, a kind of internal drag that makes starting feel harder than it should be. You sit down to begin something and find yourself doing anything else. Checking your phone. Cleaning something that does not need cleaning. Telling yourself you will start when the timing is better, when you feel more prepared, when the world around you cooperates in some particular way that it has not yet managed. But the timing is never better, and you never feel prepared enough, because the fear is not actually about timing or preparation. It is about the possibility of falling short. Then there is the fear of success, which sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud, but is surprisingly common and surprisingly powerful. What happens if this actually works? What changes? What will be expected of you that you might not be able to consistently deliver? What parts of your current life will you have to alter or give up? Change, even positive change, is disorienting. The brain is wired to treat the unfamiliar as a potential threat. And so even when you want something deeply, part of you may be pulling back. Not because you do not want to succeed, but because succeeding would mean entering unknown territory, and the mind tends to prefer a familiar discomfort over an unfamiliar possibility, however better that possibility might be. There is also the fear of judgment, of being seen trying and failing, of being perceived as overreaching, as naive, as someone who thought they were more capable than they turned out to be. This fear lives in the deeply social parts of the brain, parts that have been finely tuned over thousands of years of human evolution to care intensely about how others perceive us. In prehistoric communities, being rejected by the group could quite literally mean death. So the brain developed a fierce alertness to social risk, and while the stakes today are rarely so primal, the brain has not entirely updated its alarm system. It still treats public failure or social disapproval as something uncomfortably close to a survival threat. So we hesitate, we hold back. We wait until we are certain enough, ready enough, polished enough, which means, in many cases, we never quite begin. Beyond fear, another hidden reason people feel stuck is the absence of clarity. Many people know broadly what they want: more peace, more purpose, more creative expression, healthier relationships. But knowing what you want in a general sense is very different from having a concrete understanding of what the next specific step actually looks like. And without that clarity, the mind tends to stall. It circles. It generates questions without answering them. It produces that particular kind of mental fog that makes action feel impossible, even when the desire for change is genuinely, powerfully present. Doubt is another constant companion on this list. Self-doubt is not the same as self-awareness, though they can feel similar. Self-awareness asks honest, useful questions. What can I realistically achieve? What do I need to learn? Where have I genuinely fallen short, and how can I adjust? Self-doubt, by contrast, simply undermines. It does not help you grow. It paralyzes you. And it can be so deeply familiar, such a constant background presence, that you stop noticing it as something separate from truth. You start to simply believe it. And what you believe about yourself shapes, more than almost anything else, what you are willing to attempt. There is also the deeply human pattern of waiting for certainty before acting. This one is subtle, because it masquerades as wisdom. Being careful, being thorough, these are not inherently bad impulses, but they become limiting when certainty becomes the non-negotiable condition for action. Because certainty almost never arrives. Not before you start a business, or ask for help, or make a significant life change. Uncertainty is not the opposite of good judgment. It is the environment in which all meaningful decisions are made. Waiting for it to resolve is, in most cases, simply another form of waiting. These hidden reasons, fear in its many forms, self-doubt, the absence of clarity, and the pursuit of certainty, do not operate in isolation. They reinforce each other, creating an internal feedback loop that keeps you in place, even when every conscious part of you wants to move. Fear produces hesitation, which produces inaction, which the mind reads as evidence that the goal was perhaps not realistic, which amplifies doubt, which makes the next attempt feel even more risky. Understanding these patterns is not the same as eliminating them, but it is the beginning of something important and real, because you cannot make peace with patterns you refuse to see. And you cannot change what you are not willing to honestly acknowledge. So let us keep looking. There is a version of thinking that builds things, that explores problems carefully, weighs options with genuine consideration, develops insight through examination, and leads to better decisions. This kind of thinking is genuinely valuable. It is part of what makes human beings capable of complex, creative, and meaningful action. And then there is the other kind. The kind that circles, that returns again and again to the same questions without ever arriving at usable answers. That generates elaborate mental scenarios. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if I am wrong? What if I am missing something crucial? Not to solve a problem, but simply to process anxiety in a way that feels productive without actually being productive. This is overthinking. And for many people who feel stuck, it is the primary engine of their stagnation. Overthinking is seductive precisely because it feels like work. It feels like you are doing something. When you spend hours analyzing a decision from every possible angle, considering every conceivable outcome, it can genuinely feel like thoroughness, like the responsible, intellectually rigorous thing to do. But there is a point at which thinking stops serving the decision and starts replacing it. A point at which the mind is no longer working toward clarity, but working to avoid the vulnerability of committing. The internal activity becomes a substitute for the external one. And that is the uncomfortable truth about overthinking at its core. It is often a sophisticated form of avoidance. Not the obvious kind, not simply walking away from something, but the subtler kind that keeps you mentally engaged while keeping you physically still. The mind is active, even exhausted, but nothing is actually happening in the world. No step is taken, no choice is made, no direction is committed to. The mental activity provides just enough of a sense of effort to quiet the guilt that would otherwise push you to actually do something. This pattern tends to show up most intensely around decisions that genuinely matter. The bigger the potential stakes, the more the mind wants to gather information, run through scenarios, test every possible angle. And while some of this careful thinking is genuinely useful, it quickly reaches a point of sharply diminishing returns. Past a certain threshold, more thinking does not produce better decisions. It produces more anxiety, more confusion, more competing considerations, and ultimately, more paralysis. One of the core mechanisms of overthinking is what psychologists sometimes call analysis paralysis. You have so many options, so many variables, so many potential outcomes to weigh against each other, that the sheer volume of mental content makes it effectively impossible to settle on anything. The mind becomes overwhelmed, not by the actual difficulty of the choice, but by the quantity of information it is trying to process simultaneously. And so it keeps spinning, keeps reviewing, because making a decision feels more dangerous than continuing to analyze. A decision is a commitment. A commitment forecloses other options, and the mind would rather keep all options technically alive in the space of possibility, even if that means never actually pursuing any of them. There is also a particular kind of overthinking that is less about external decisions and more about self-evaluation. The rumination that revisits past mistakes, rehearses imagined future failures, and picks apart your motives, your capabilities, your worthiness. This kind of internal commentary can run almost continuously in the background. A quiet but constant drain on mental energy and confidence. Every time you consider taking a step forward, the rumination pipes up with a catalogue of reasons to reconsider. And if you have spent enough time in this pattern, you can start to mistake the catalogue for reality. It is worth understanding why the mind does this. The brain is fundamentally oriented towards survival, and a significant portion of its resources is dedicated to anticipating threats before they occur. In a physical environment, this is enormously useful. But when this threat detection system is applied to the internal landscape of decisions and self-assessment, it tends to over-generate. It sees threats where there are none. It catastrophizes outcomes that are statistically unlikely. It treats the normal discomfort of uncertainty as though it were equivalent to actual danger. The result is a mind working very hard to protect you from things that may never happen, while simultaneously preventing you from doing the things that could genuinely improve your life. Breaking the pattern of overthinking is not about stopping yourself from thinking altogether. Thinking is not the problem. The problem is thinking that is not anchored to action. One of the most useful reframes for someone who struggles with overthinking is this: a good enough decision made and acted upon today is almost always more valuable than a perfect decision theoretically arrived at, but never executed. Because in the real world, action generates information. It produces feedback. It shows you what is actually true rather than what you imagine might be true. And that feedback, real, specific, grounded in actual experience, is what allows you to adjust and keep moving forward. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called the thinking-doing gap. The distance between forming an intention and actually following through on it. For people who struggle with overthinking, this gap can become enormous. The intention is formed, the planning happens, the analysis accumulates, but the doing never quite arrives, and over time, this gap becomes its own kind of habit. The pattern of planning without executing becomes so familiar that it starts to feel normal. The thinking becomes the identity, and doing, actual, committed, in the world doing, begins to feel foreign. Closing this gap requires a deliberate interruption of the overthinking loop. Not by force, stopping the thoughts, but by choosing to take some form of action, even in the presence of incomplete certainty, even a small action, even an imperfect one. Because action, however modest, starts to shift the relationship between thinking and doing. It demonstrates, through direct experience, that movement is possible even when the analysis is not complete. And slowly, with repetition, it begins to rebuild the habit of doing. It also helps to recognize when you are using thinking as a comfort mechanism. When the mental activity is not actually moving you toward a better decision, but is simply generating a sense of productive engagement while keeping you safely in place. In those moments, the most useful thing you can say to yourself is this: I know enough to take the next step. I do not need to know everything. I can learn the rest by moving. Because the mind does not quiet itself through more thinking. It quiets itself through doing. Through the real, grounding experience of engaging with the world and discovering that you can handle what comes. The person who thinks their way out of stagnation is rare. The person who acts their way into clarity is almost everyone who has ever genuinely moved forward. Think enough to orient yourself. Then move. There is a story that belongs to more people than most of them realize. It is the story of someone who wanted things, genuinely, deeply wanted them, and who spent years preparing to begin. Preparing so thoroughly, so continuously, that the preparing became a life in itself, and the beginning kept receding just beyond the horizon. Her name was Adaze. She was 30, 4 years old when she first admitted to herself, on an ordinary Tuesday evening sitting alone in her kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, that she had been waiting for something she could not quite name. Not waiting passively. She was, by any external measure, a capable, thoughtful, organized person. She had a degree she had worked hard for, a steady job that paid her bills and occasionally even interested her. A comfortable apartment. People in her life who cared about her, but she had also, somewhere in her late 20s, arrived at a kind of internal crossroads that she had never quite been able to navigate. And the waiting had begun there. She had always wanted to write. Not as a hobby, though she had framed it that way for years to make it feel safer, but as something central to who she was. Something real. She had notebooks filled with ideas that excited her. Chapters started and abandoned. Stories that felt alive inside her and somehow became smaller and thinner when she tried to put them on the page. She believed she had something worth saying. She just was not ready, she told herself, to say it in the way it deserved to be said. The gap between the writing in her imagination and the writing on the page felt too wide. The imagined writing was luminous. The actual writing was ordinary, and she could not quite accept ordinary. The waiting began as something reasonable. She would start when she had more time, when work was less demanding, when she had read more widely and understood the craft at a deeper level, when she felt ready, and by ready she meant confident, and by confident she meant certain, and certainty, she would discover slowly and at some cost, was a condition that kept moving whenever she approached it. So she held the conditions, and she waited. Time passed, as time does, indifferently and without pause. She read books about writing, good books, useful books. She attended a weekend workshop and sat in the back row and listened carefully and told herself she was not quite ready to share her own work yet. She started a document on her computer called The Draft and opened it every few weeks, wrote a paragraph or two, read it back with growing dissatisfaction, and closed it again without saving. She followed writers she admired and felt a complicated mixture of genuine inspiration and something that sat uncomfortably close to envy, not of their success, exactly, but of the simple fact that they had done it. They had put the work into the world, and there it was, imperfect, sometimes flawed, but real and existing, while her work remained theoretical, potential, safe. She could articulate the fear on the days when she was being fully honest with herself. What if she finished something, actually finished it, and it was not good? Not the not good of a work in progress, but the not good of something genuinely, finally assessed as insufficient. What if she sent it into the world and it was met with silence, or with the particular, deflating politeness of rejection? What if the thing she had believed for years that she had to offer turned out to be, upon actual examination, ordinary? These were questions without comfortable answers, and so her mind preferred to keep them theoretical, because as long as she had not fully tried, not really, not with everything on the table, she had not fully failed. The possibility remained intact. The imagined version of herself who wrote well and whose writing mattered was still, technically, possible. And that theoretical self was something she was unwilling to put to the real test of actual completion and actual exposure. There were people in her life who asked about the writing, friends who would inquire occasionally with genuine interest and affection, and she would tell them what had become her standard answer. She was working on something. She would share it when it was ready. She just needed a little more time. The words felt true every time she said them, but the time accumulated and the work did not, and the gap between the conversations and any finished thing only widened. After a while she stopped bringing it up herself. It became a private thing, a tender, exposed place she did not want pressed on, the most painful part. And she would turn this over in her mind on the longer, quieter evenings, was the growing awareness of what the waiting was costing her. Not in visible, external ways. Her life looked fine from the outside, but she knew the texture of a day spent not doing the thing you care about most, the quiet background hum of unfulfillment, the way a creative impulse, left unexpressed for long enough, starts to feel less like a gift and more like a kind of pressure, like something building behind a sealed door. Not dangerous, but insistent, always present. She would sometimes imagine herself at 50, at 60. The imagining was tender and frightening in equal measure, because she could see both versions of herself so clearly. One version had taken the risk, had written the imperfect things and revised them, and kept going, and eventually found a way to share them, had lived the second half of her life in fuller contact with the thing she cared about most deeply, and the other version had kept waiting, had found the conditions never quite right enough, had arrived at old age with the notebooks still full of ideas and the novels still unwritten and a particular kind of grief that had no name, but was no less real for that. She did not want to become the second version. She knew that, clearly and consistently, and yet, on most days, she woke up and did exactly what she had always done. Everything except the thing. The breakthrough, when it came, was not dramatic. One Sunday morning, grey, unremarkable, she sat down at her kitchen table, opened the document she had been circling for years, and instead of evaluating what was there, instead of planning what it could become, she simply wrote, without judgment, without revision, without the self-critical voice she usually allowed to take over before she had even finished a sentence. She wrote badly, and she kept writing. She wrote for 40 minutes. What emerged was imperfect and occasionally clumsy and alive in a way the polished imaginary version never quite was. She did not solve anything that morning, but something shifted, not in the writing, but in her, in the relationship between her and the doing, the act itself, the simple, unceremonious fact of having done it instead of thinking about doing it. She sat with that shift quietly for a while, as the coffee cooled beside her, and she thought with a clarity that felt almost startling, this is what I have been waiting for. Not better circumstances, not greater readiness, just this, the act itself. The willingness to begin without needing to know the outcome. It was not the end of the struggle. Old habits do not dissolve in a single morning. But it was a beginning, a genuine beginning, not the rehearsed and imagined beginning she had been cycling through for years. And that difference changed almost everything. Because a real beginning, once made, leaves a mark, it becomes evidence. Evidence that movement is possible, that the version of herself who writes is not theoretical, after all, but real, present, available, if she chooses to show up for her, A daisy's story is not unusual. It reflects something deeply recognizable to almost anyone who has ever wanted something deeply and found themselves, time and again, not quite doing the thing that would bring them closer to it. The way inaction compounds over time, making the first step feel larger and more consequential with every passing day. The longer you do not do something, the harder it can feel to begin. Not because the task itself has become harder, but because the story you tell about it has grown heavier. This is the self-reinforcing cycle of inaction. You do not move, so the thing feels harder, so you feel less equipped to face it. So you generate more reasons to wait, so you do not move. The cycle repeats. And it does not require any active decision to maintain. It maintains itself, below the level of conscious intention, until something interrupts it. Understanding this cycle, seeing it clearly, naming it honestly, is the first necessary step toward interrupting it. And the interruption does not need to be dramatic. In fact, it almost never is. What breaks cycles of inaction is not some enormous, sweeping gesture of effort or courage. It is almost always something small, a single email sent, a single paragraph written, a single conversation begun, a single day on which you do the thing, instead of thinking about it. The smallness of the first action is not a limitation, it is the point. Because the purpose of the small action is not to solve everything at once. It is to re-establish contact, to prove to yourself, through experience rather than further deliberation, that you are capable of moving. There is a concept that shows up consistently across many disciplines, from behavioral psychology to entrepreneurship to coaching, that describes this dynamic in a way worth understanding. The idea that action produces motivation, rather than the other way around. Most people believe, quite reasonably, that they need to feel motivated before they act, that the right emotional state must arrive first, and action follows. But research on motivation suggests this is actually backwards. Motivation, in most cases, follows action. You begin something, however reluctantly, however imperfectly, and the act of beginning generates its own forward energy. You feel more engaged than you expected, more capable, more willing to continue. This is precisely why waiting to feel ready is such an effective trap. The feeling of readiness is not a prerequisite for beginning. It is usually a consequence of it. And if you wait for it to arrive before you start, you may wait for a very long time. Starting before you feel ready does not mean starting carelessly. It means accepting that the discomfort of beginning is not evidence that you should not begin. It is just the natural friction of any meaningful endeavor. Every worthwhile thing in your life began with a first step that was uncertain, imperfect, slightly uncomfortable. And if you look back at those beginnings now, you probably cannot imagine having stayed frozen at the threshold forever. You are glad you moved. Breaking cycles of inaction is also helped enormously by shifting the metric of success. When the measure of success is the grand outcome, the finished book, the launched business, the complete transformation, then any step short of that feels like falling short, and the anticipation of falling short produces hesitation. But when the measure of success becomes the action itself, did I show up today? Did I do the thing, however imperfectly? The entire equation changes. A day in which you sent one email toward something that matters is a successful day. A morning in which you wrote 3 flawed paragraphs is a successful morning. A week in which you had one difficult conversation, made one small decision, took one step toward something meaningful. That is a successful week, not because the goal has been achieved, but because direction has been established. This shift in focus, from outcome to process, from perfection to participation, is not a way of lowering your standards. It is a way of keeping your standards livable, because standards that require perfection at every step tend to produce inaction at every step. Standards that reward genuine, consistent effort produce the kind of sustained momentum that actually gets you somewhere real. It also helps practically to reduce the size of the step. When a goal feels overwhelming, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels too wide, the natural response is to freeze. But the solution is not to stare across the gap, waiting for it to narrow. It is to stop trying to cross it all at once and ask a different question. What is the smallest possible action I could take right now? Something so small that refusing to do it would feel almost absurd. That is your starting point. Not because it is the whole answer, but because it moves you off the mark. It sets the flywheel turning. And once the flywheel is turning, everything changes. One of the most underappreciated causes of stagnation is not fear, and not laziness, and not a lack of effort. It is confusion, a genuine, often unexamined confusion about what you are actually working toward and why. A fogginess about direction that makes every step feel uncertain and every decision feel like it could be wrong. Most people walk through their daily lives carrying a collection of vague and shapeless desires. They want to be happy. But happiness is not a direction. They want to be successful. But success is not a plan. They want to feel more secure, more connected, more purposeful. These are real and deeply valid desires. But they are not directions. They do not tell you what to do on a Tuesday morning when you have 2 hours free and a dozen possible ways to fill them. Without clarity, even the most motivated, most capable person can find themselves moving in circles, busy but directionless, active but not progressing, working hard but somehow not advancing. And the frustrating paradox of this state is that the effort itself can actually make it harder to step back and ask whether the effort is pointing in the right direction. Clarity, in this context, is not about having your entire future mapped out in precise detail. It is not about knowing exactly how your life will look in 10 years. What clarity actually requires is something more modest, but more immediately useful knowing, with reasonable specificity, what you are trying to do and what the next concrete step in that direction looks like. When you have this kind of working clarity, decisions become simpler. You have a reference point. You can ask about any choice in front of you. Does this bring me closer to where I am trying to go, or does it take me further away? That single question, applied consistently, cuts through enormous amounts of unnecessary complexity. It filters out the noise. It helps you prioritize when everything seems equally important. It helps you release what does not serve the direction you have chosen. Gaining clarity is itself a practice, rather than a destination. And one of the most effective ways to begin developing it is through honest, unhurried inquiry. Not the circular kind of self-questioning that overthinking produces, but genuinely exploratory questioning. What do you actually want? Not what you think you should want. Not what would impress the people around you. Not what makes logical or conventional sense given the life you have built. But what do you genuinely, deeply, privately want for your life? What kind of days do you want to be living? What do you want to be creating, contributing, experiencing? These questions are worth sitting with, worth returning to more than once, because the answers that surface after you strip away the accumulated weight of other people's expectations and your own internalized should have bins are often different, sometimes significantly different from what you initially thought. And those deeper, truer answers are the ones worth building a direction from. It is also worth getting specific, more specific than feels comfortable at first. Specific about what success in your chosen area would actually look and feel like in practice. Specific about what would be different about your experience compared to what it is now. This kind of honest specificity is not wishful thinking. It is the necessary work of making something real enough in your mind that you can begin orienting your actual choices and actions toward it. Vague goals produce vague actions. Clear goals produce clear action. Understanding your values is another essential dimension of building useful clarity. When you know, really know, at a level deeper than articulation, what matters most to you, you have a reliable basis for making decisions that feel congruent rather than conflicted. So many people experience a persistent, low-level sense of being out of alignment, choosing paths that look impressive but feel hollow, maintaining commitments that no longer match who they are becoming. Clarity about values is a form of radical honesty with yourself. It can be uncomfortable to arrive at, but once arrived at, it is profoundly liberating. It simplifies. When you know what matters, you know what to do. Clarity is not a fixed destination. It is an ongoing practice of honest attention to your own life. Checking in with yourself regularly, adjusting your direction as you grow, letting your understanding be informed by what you are learning from your actual experience in the world. Begin there, with honest questions, with specific, courageous answers, with the willingness to know what you actually want and to let that knowing guide you. Fear does not go away. This is perhaps one of the most important and most uncomfortable truths that anyone on a genuine path of growth eventually has to reckon with, and reckoning with it fully. Not trying to argue past it or wish it away, but accepting it honestly, is what makes sustained progress possible. The goal is not to eliminate fear. The goal is to change your relationship with it. Most of us, when we encounter fear in the context of something we want to pursue, interpret it automatically as a signal to stop, to wait, to reassess whether this is really a good idea. And fear can, in some circumstances, carry genuinely useful information, a warning that something deserves closer examination, that we have overlooked something important. In those cases, fear is worth heeding. But in the context of personal growth, of stepping toward meaningful goals and making real changes, fear is very often less about actual danger and more about unfamiliarity, the brain's alarm system responding to novelty and uncertainty. And while those experiences are genuinely uncomfortable, they are not the same as danger. Learning to distinguish between fear that is genuinely informative and fear that is simply the brain's resistance to change. This is one of the central, most practically valuable skills of a person who is able to keep moving through challenging territory. Informative fear is specific. It points to something concrete that can be addressed. Resistive fear is vaguer, more diffuse. It says this is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things could go wrong in ways I cannot predict. It is the feeling of standing at the edge of a diving board you have never jumped from before. Not because the water is dangerous, but because your body has no stored experience of this particular thing. The antidote to resistive fear is not courage in the heroic, cinematic sense. the dramatic surge of bravery that sweeps anxiety aside and sends you charging forward. That kind of courage exists, but it is not reliable enough to build a life of growth on. The more sustainable form of courage is something simpler and quieter. The willingness to act in the presence of fear, not after it has fully subsided, but while it is still present, still uncomfortable, still making its noise, and choosing to move anyway. This is what decades of research in behavioral and cognitive psychology has confirmed. The most effective way to reduce fear is not to avoid the thing you fear. Avoidance provides short-term relief. The moment you decide not to do the scary thing, the anxiety decreases. But the relief is temporary and expensive, because every time you avoid something you fear, you send a powerful message to your nervous system. This thing is indeed too dangerous to face. The avoidance reinforces the fear. The fear grows stronger. The avoidance becomes more deeply habitual, and the gap between you and what you want becomes wider with every cycle of retreat. Action, even imperfect and anxious action, sends the opposite message. It says, I went toward this thing, and I survived it, and this direct, embodied experience, not reasoned argument, not reassurance from others, but the actual lived experience of having faced the thing and come through, is what begins, over time, to reduce fear's power. Each encounter with the feared situation, in which you discover that you can handle what comes, is evidence your nervous system can actually use. And that evidence accumulates. What felt terrifying the first time feels manageable the fifth time. What was unthinkable becomes thinkable, then doable, then eventually just a thing you do. Uncertainty is fear's close companion, and it deserves its own honest examination. We live in a moment when the amount of information available to us is staggering, and we use much of that access in the service of trying to eliminate unknowns before we act. We research extensively. We seek expert opinions. We try to know, as completely as possible, what we are getting into before we get into it. While information is valuable and careful preparation useful, there is a point at which the pursuit of certainty becomes another form of delay. The thing you are waiting to know before you can begin is not something that can be known in advance. It is only knowable through the doing. Real life does not offer certainty. Every significant decision you will ever make, what work to pursue, where to live, what to create, what relationships to invest in, involves genuine uncertainty about outcomes. You can gather information. You can think clearly and plan carefully. You can take considered risks rather than careless ones. But you cannot eliminate the unknown from the equation. It is structurally part of the equation. And if you cannot find a way to act in its presence, you will spend a great deal of your precious life waiting for a condition that will never fully arrive. There is something quietly powerful in learning to make peace with not knowing, not through denial of uncertainty, not through pretending risks do not exist, but through a different, more mature relationship with the unknown, one that treats uncertainty not as an obstacle blocking the path, but as a natural feature of any path worth traveling. The most interesting, meaningful, and genuinely fulfilling paths in life, almost without exception, run through uncertain territory. The certainty is not what makes the journey worthwhile. The willingness to take it, despite its absence, is. And so the question is not, how can I act without fear? The question is, what am I willing to face, knowing that the alternative is remaining where I am? Because staying still is not free. It has its own price, paid in the quiet accumulation of regret, in the narrowing of possibilities over time, in the growing distance between the life you are living and the life you know you are capable of. There is a concept in physics, the flywheel, that describes something profoundly useful for anyone trying to build momentum in their life. A flywheel is a large, heavy disk that stores rotational energy. When you first attempt to turn it, the resistance is considerable. Every push moves it only a small fraction. But as you keep pushing, push after push, each one adding marginally to the accumulated energy, the wheel begins to carry its own momentum. And after enough consistent, patient effort, it reaches a point where it is generating its own forward energy, and the effort required to keep it moving decreases significantly. This is an almost perfect metaphor for how consistency works in the development of a human life. The beginning of any meaningful change is always the hardest part. Not because you are incapable, but because you are turning something from a complete standstill. The habits are not yet established. The neural pathways have not been deepened by repetition. The identity, the sense of yourself as someone who does this thing, has not yet settled into something self-reinforcing. Everything about the initial stage of building something new requires more conscious effort, more deliberate intention, more energy than it will later require. And this is precisely the moment when most people stop. They push the wheel several times with genuine effort and intention. They feel how heavy it is. They notice how little their effort has visibly moved it. They compare where they thought they would be to where they actually are, and they conclude, reasonably but incorrectly, that it must not be working, and so they stop, and the wheel slows back to stillness. But the physics of momentum does not care about your feelings in any particular moment. What turns the wheel is repeated, consistent effort, even when the results are not yet visible, even when the effort seems disproportionate to the movement it produces, even when the voice in your head is questioning whether any of this is worth continuing. Consistency is not glamorous. On any given day, it looks like nothing special. A small action taken, a quiet habit maintained, an unremarkable choice made in a familiar direction. But accumulated across weeks, months, and years, consistency produces results that can genuinely seem remarkable from the outside. Not because they are magical, but because the compounding nature of small, repeated actions over time is difficult to perceive from within the process, and astonishing to witness from the other side. Consider what it means to practice something genuinely, attentively for 30 minutes every day. On any given day, 30 minutes seems modest. It does not feel like transformation, but 30 minutes every day for a year is more than 180 hours of focused practice, and 180 hours of genuine, engaged practice in almost any meaningful area of human skill will produce real, significant growth. This is not magic. It is arithmetic. It is the steady accumulation of small efforts into something larger than any individual effort could have produced. The challenge with consistency is that it demands a relationship with boredom and ordinariness that most people find difficult. The interesting, energizing moments in any endeavor are relatively rare. What fills the vast majority of the space between them is repetition. The quiet, often unremarkable work of showing up again, doing the thing again, making the choice, once more, to continue, even when it no longer feels new, and the initial enthusiasm has long since faded. This is where real growth lives. In the middle ground that requires the most faith and produces the least immediate gratification. Building systems rather than relying on motivation is one of the most practically useful strategies for maintaining consistency across time. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are, by their nature, variable. If your consistency depends on the presence of sufficient motivation, it will be exactly as reliable as your moods. Systems, by contrast, are structures that operate independently of your mood. When you have a clear system, a specific time, a specific place, a specific sequence that you follow, because that is what you do, you reduce dramatically the mental friction of initiating. The decision has already been made. All that remains is execution. And finally, acknowledging your small wins genuinely and regularly is not trivial. It is neurologically significant. The brain's reward and reinforcement systems are activated by the recognition of progress, even small progress. This activation makes the repetition of the relevant behavior more likely. When you notice and acknowledge a small success, you are encoding a message in your nervous system. This kind of effort produces results. This kind of showing up leads somewhere, and that message, repeated over time, makes the next effort slightly easier to initiate. Consistency is the quiet superpower of anyone who has ever built something meaningful. Not intensity, not brilliance, not inspiration, just the willingness, day after ordinary day, to show up again. Perfectionism is one of the most clever of all the inner barriers. It disguises itself reliably as high standards, as genuine care, as the admirable refusal to put anything into the world that is not worthy of your best. It dresses itself in the language of quality and craftsmanship and integrity, and the desire for quality is a genuine virtue. The problem is when perfectionism takes that desire past the point where it serves you and into the territory where it stops you. The perfectionist does not actually produce more perfect work. This is one of the great painful ironies of the pattern. Perfectionism, as it actually functions in the psychological life of a real person, is not primarily about the work. It is about protection. It is about managing the fear of exposure, the fear of having your effort assessed and found wanting. And the most reliable strategy for managing that fear is to never quite finish, never quite release, never quite put the thing fully into the world where it can be encountered and evaluated on its own terms. This is perfectionism's quiet bargain. You keep the thing safe, and yourself safe, by keeping it perpetually in a state of incompleteness. The novel is always being drafted. The business plan is always being refined. The difficult conversation is always being prepared for, but never initiated, and the perfection you are ostensibly aiming for remains forever theoretical, preserved in the imagination, where it cannot be tested, where it cannot fall short. One of the most practically useful reframes for someone working through perfectionism is the concept of the minimum viable version. Not the minimum careless version, but the minimum viable version. The version that is complete enough, honest enough, real enough to actually exist in the world and do what it is meant to do. The first draft that actually ends on a last page. The business idea shared with a trusted colleague. The imperfect but genuine creative attempt offered up for engagement. The minimum viable version is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of something that can now be improved by contact with reality. And this is worth sitting with. You cannot improve a thing that does not yet exist. The draft that lives only in your imagination is not improvable. The actual draft, imperfect, occasionally clumsy, genuinely there, can be revised, refined, grown into something better than it started. But only because it started. Perfectionism also tends to be defeating in a very specific way. The longer you wait to begin, the longer you spend preparing, polishing the imaginary version, the more perfect the thing needs to be before you will allow yourself to release it. Because the longer you have been working up to this, the higher the internal standards have become. The imagined judgment grows harsher. The gap between where you are and where you feel you need to be only widens. Waiting does not lower the bar of perfectionism, it raises it. And so the very act of prolonged preparation tends to make the beginning even further away. There is also something important in understanding where perfectionism comes from. For many people, it has roots in early experiences where worth and performance were closely linked. Where love, approval, or safety depended on doing things correctly, on not making visible mistakes. These experiences teach a powerful lesson, that imperfection is dangerous, that falling short has real consequences, and once absorbed, that lesson does not dissolve easily. It shapes how you approach everything that matters. Recognizing this does not mean you are condemned to remain in the perfectionist pattern, but it means the work of releasing perfectionism involves some genuine compassion for yourself, understanding that the perfectionism was a learned response to circumstances that were genuinely demanding, and recognizing that you are capable of choosing a different relationship with your own imperfection. One that is more honest, more kind, and ultimately more productive. One that can hold both the desire for quality and the willingness to act before perfection arrives. Because perfection, as a condition for beginning, will never arrive. Done is better than perfect. Not because quality does not matter, but because the imperfect, finished thing is infinitely more valuable than the perfect, unfinished one. The essay that exists and can be read. The project that is complete and can be iterated upon. The conversation that happened and can now be continued. Real things in the world, available for engagement and growth. Give yourself permission to produce something imperfect, to share something unfinished, to take a step without the outcome guaranteed. This is not a lowering of standards, it is a deepening of courage, the recognition that growth does not happen in the anticipation of perfection. It happens in the brave, imperfect, fully human act of doing anyway. It began with a list, not a grand plan, not a vision board, not a carefully designed system with milestones and accountability structures. Just a list, written on the back of an old receipt, because there was no notebook nearby, of 3 things that Emeka wanted to do before the end of the week. 3 things only, small enough that writing them down felt almost embarrassingly modest. Emeka was 41. He had spent the better part of the last decade doing what he described to people as figuring things out. Which was true, in the sense that he thought about his life constantly. He thought often about the photography he had set aside when the combined weight of work deadlines and family responsibilities had left him to rein for anything without immediate, practical purpose. He thought about the community project he had once felt genuinely excited about. Something local. Something that would connect people in his neighborhood who passed each other daily without recognition. He thought about the freelance creative work that would let him reclaim some of the identity he had packed away for safekeeping years ago. He thought about these things often, but thinking had not produced movement, and at some point, the accumulated weight of the unlived intentions had become its own quiet exhaustion. The list on the back of the receipt had 3 items. The first was to take his camera out of the closet, where it had been stored for 3 years and simply hold it. Not to photograph anything, just to make physical contact with the thing again. The second was to walk around his neighborhood for 30 minutes and look at it, the way he used to look at things before. He stopped giving himself permission to see photographically. And the third was to send one message, brief, plain, no elaboration, to a person who had once offered to help him think through the community project idea and whom he had not contacted in over a year. The items were so small they almost embarrassed him. He had spent so much time imagining large and meaningful action that these three things felt almost trivial. But something in him recognized, quietly, that this was precisely the problem. The imagined action was always large. The gap between where he was and where the large action required him to be was always too wide. So he never crossed it. He stood at the edge and thought about crossing it, and went to bed and thought about it again tomorrow. He took the camera out of the closet on a Tuesday evening. He sat with it in his lap and turned it over in his hands. He noticed how the weight of it felt familiar in a way that was unexpectedly moving. Not painfully nostalgic, just real. The weight of a thing that was his, that he had used for years to look at the world more carefully. And he had been away from it for a long time. The walk happened on Wednesday after dinner. He went out with no agenda, no camera, no pressure to produce or notice anything in particular. He walked the same streets he walked every day and looked at them differently. He noticed how a particular alleyway caught the late afternoon light at an angle that made it look almost luminous against the surrounding shadows. He noticed the old man sitting outside the corner shop with the same concentrated quietness he had sat there every evening for years. He did not take photographs. He just noticed. And the noticing itself felt like something returning to him. Something that had been waiting patiently for the invitation. The message was harder than the other two. He held off until Thursday evening, typed it and deleted it, and typed a shorter version and deleted that too, and then sent a version that was 3 sentences long, a greeting. A brief and honest acknowledgement that he had let a long silence accumulate, and a simple expression of interest in reconnecting. He put his phone face down before he could read it back and guess it. The response came the following morning, brief and warm, and entirely uncomplicated. It said, with the directness of someone who had no interest in making things difficult, "I was wondering when I would hear from you. I am free next week." What followed was not a transformation, not the dramatic overhaul his imagined self had been planning for years. It was more gradual than that, and more honest, and in its honesty more durable. He began photographing again slowly, without pressure, often just in the quiet hour before dinner. The photos were uneven. Some of them were genuinely good. Many were ordinary. He did not share them for a while. He just made them, because making them felt like being more fully himself. The meeting about the community project happened 2 weeks later. It was exploratory and inconclusive. No decisions made, no commitments yet. But it opened a door that had been closed for a year and a half, not by any external lock, but by his own reluctance to simply knock on it. And knocking, it turned out, was all that had been required. He did not quit his job. He did not overhaul his schedule or produce any dramatic visible change. He simply began moving, in small, consistent increments, in the direction of the things that actually mattered to him. And the movement, modest, unremarkable in any given moment, changed something real in the texture of his daily experience. The background heaviness gradually lightened. The gap between who he was and who he wanted to be had become something he was crossing rather than something he was contemplating from the edge of. The list on the back of the receipt was not the solution to anything. It was the beginning of one. And beginning, he remembered now, with something that felt like relief, was always what made everything else possible. You have stayed with this entire journey. The examination of fear and overthinking, the honest reckoning with perfectionism and inaction, and the quiet cost of waiting. And the fact that you have stayed tells you something worth paying attention to. Some part of you is ready to understand more clearly what has been holding you back. Ready to approach your own life with more honesty and more compassion. Ready, perhaps, to begin moving in a direction that matters, in whatever form that movement is available to you today. Let us close with what is most true. You are not broken. Whatever stagnation you have experienced, whatever patterns have kept you in place longer than you intended, whatever fears and doubts and habits of mind have made the path forward feel harder than it needed to be, none of that is evidence of a fundamental deficiency in you. It is evidence of your humanity. It is the shared experience of an enormous number of people who are also, right now, somewhere on the path between where they are and where they want to be. People who are capable, who care, who want their lives to reflect more of who they actually are and less of who their fear has allowed them to be. People who are, like you, learning. The feeling of being stuck is not permanent. It is a state, a temporary condition produced by specific, identifiable patterns of thinking, feeling, and behavior. And because it is produced by patterns, it can be changed by changing the patterns, not all at once, not through a single, sweeping act of will, but gradually, with patience and consistency, through the repeated practice of small, honest, increasingly courageous choices made in the direction of what matters. Fear will stay with you. This is not a problem to be solved. It is a feature of any life that is genuinely engaged with something meaningful. The goal is not a life without fear. The goal is a life in which the desire to grow and contribute and become more fully yourself is a little stronger, a little more persistent, a little more trustworthy than the instinct to stay safe and still. A life in which you act despite the fear, because you have learned, through experience, not theory, that the discomfort of doing is always more valuable than the relief of not trying. Clarity will need tending. It is not something you arrive at once and then possess forever, unchanging. It shifts as you grow, as your circumstances evolve, as you learn more about who you actually are and what genuinely matters to you. Clarity is an ongoing practice, a commitment to regular honest inquiry, to checking in with yourself without judgment, to adjusting your direction based on what you are learning from your actual lived experience. Perfectionism will try to return. It always does. It will show up wearing the face of high standards and genuine care, and it will ask you, once more, to wait a little longer, prepare a little more, get a little closer to certain before you take the next step. You can thank it for its concern. It comes from a real place, trying, in its misguided way, to protect you, and then you can choose to move anyway. Because the world does not need you to be perfect. It needs you to show up, fully, genuinely, imperfectly, and real. Consistency will be the most reliable path forward. Not inspiration, not genius, not the perfect strategy. Just the quiet, unglamorous, profoundly powerful willingness to show up again, to do the thing again, to recommit to the direction you have chosen, today, regardless of how yesterday felt or how uncertain tomorrow looks. Every meaningful thing that has ever been built, every skill developed, every relationship deepened, every creative work brought into the world, was built through this kind of accumulating effort. The steady, patient, often invisible work of small actions taken consistently over enough time to compound into something significant. And here is what to carry with you beyond everything else that has been explored in these pages. You are not stuck forever, you are paused. And a pause by its very nature is temporary. The moment you take one action, however small, however uncertain, however imperfect, you begin to move. Not metaphorically, actually. The cycle of inaction is interrupted. The flywheel begins to turn. The momentum that felt impossibly far away reveals itself to be only one genuine step distant from where you are standing right now. You do not need to know the whole path. You do not need to have all the answers, or the right conditions, or the certainty that it will work. You need the next step, just the next one, clear enough to take, honest enough to be real, and brave enough, just barely brave enough, to actually do it. And then the one after that. Progress is not about big leaps into perfect outcomes. It has never been about that. Progress is about small steps taken consistently in the direction of the life you are capable of building and willing to build. Steps that accumulate, steps that compound, steps that, over time, carry you to places that would have seemed unreachable from the standstill. You have always been capable of this. The question was never whether you could. The question was only whether you would choose to begin. Today you can choose that. Not because the fear is gone, or the path is entirely clear, or the outcome is guaranteed, but because you have sat with these ideas long enough to understand that the alternative, remaining where you are, continuing to wait for conditions that may never fully arrive, is also a choice, one you have been making, and one you no longer have to make. The life you want is not waiting somewhere out in the future, inaccessible and uncertain. It is being built now, action by action, day by day, choice by choice. Begin.